But first tonight, I've tried to keep my powder dry about this proposed Aboriginal voice to the Parliament. First and foremost, it's a political battle, and that's why I've chosen to leave it to the politicians until there's actually a firm proposal on the table. Then we can get into it. But in the face of the unrelenting propaganda push by the government and the support of the woke business elite, I think it's time for a reality check of what they're really putting forward. First off though, the lack of detail available from the government on this proposal is deliberate. It's kind of like Dennis Denuto from the movie The Castle. They're trying to sell the vibe. And the vibe, apparently it's meant to redress some perceived imbalance, to ensure Aboriginal voices are heard in our Parliament. Personally, I think some of the voices that we've got there already, parading their personal ancestry as some sort of cloak of immunity from criticism, do Aboriginal people a total disservice. Now, some people might disagree with that, but you cannot disagree with the fact that statistically, those identifying as Aboriginal are overrepresented in our Parliament compared to their percentage of the general population. And personally, I don't really care about that. We're all Australians, and the people and political parties can choose whom they want to represent them. However, having another elected body with special rights, entitlements or privileges attached to our governance and based entirely on race is a terrible step backwards. I had the great fortune to observe the previous incarnation of this body many years ago. It was called ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. And frankly, it was as dodgy as a $3 note. Now, you do note I said I was fortunate to see them up close. And I consider myself so because that's how I know how hopeless and corrupted the organisation was. Disbanding it was the best thing that could have been done. And now, to my mind, Labor effectively want to resurrect it, but with even more special entitlements and no doubt more money. It's a recipe for disaster. But that won't stop the political push, because right now it's being positioned as a great step forward and empowering for Aboriginal people to have a say on how policies will affect them. Again, I'll just point out they currently have the same say as the rest of us. Plus, they've got myriad organisations, they've got policies, they've got funding and opportunities that are not available to us all. Now, admittedly, these are all designed to improve the health and well-being, the standards of Aboriginal people's communities, but in my view, they've mostly been an abject failure. By almost any measure, the tens of billions of dollars of annual funding have failed to reduce the incidence of chronic disease or unemployment, domestic violence, substance abuse in many of these communities that I'm talking about. Although, I do hasten to add, the billions have improved the lives of those getting paid to implement the policies and put the programs in place. But that just shows me that something different needs to be done. But I think we still have to question whether a race-based voice to Parliament is a step forwards or a step backwards. Now, in that respect, we can learn something from New Zealand, where they've introduced such a race-based governance model. And I think it can prove instructive of what lays ahead for us, should our voice get up. Now, based on research of the New Zealand experience by the Institute of Public Affairs, the voice would, and I quote, become a vehicle for allocating critical social and economic resources, such as health, education and job opportunities, on the basis of race, not need. It would not merely be advisory, but will wield a veto over important parliamentary debate and government decisions, and it would be impossible to repeal, defund or effectively reform if it proves ineffective or is acting contrary to what was intended. Now, while the New Zealand model began very modestly, thanks to activist judges over there, it's become a binding quasi-judicial body with actually significant influence over the Parliament. According to the voice advocates over here, that wouldn't happen. But they would say that, wouldn't they? I mean, it's not as if we don't have our own activist judges here. Do you remember the High Court found that a couple of non-citizens with some traces of Aboriginal blood who moved here as children were actually unable to be deported on character grounds because they committed crimes? Now, that's just one recent decision we should be concerned about. But even if there's not the judicial activism, we should be concerned anyway. I mean, what did the PM say if a government was to ignore this proposed voice body?
Well, it would be a very brave government that said it shouldn't.
Yeah, the writing's on the wall. It would be a very brave government indeed. Now imagine if we had that same approach to the first incarnation of this parallel Aboriginal Parliament, ATSIC, that I mentioned earlier. One could only imagine how much worse things would be than they are now. So rather than committing ourselves to replicating the mistakes of other nations or to recreate our own previous problems, Australia actually needs to learn from past experience. And that experience shows that the voice will only divide our country along racial lines. And that's the very thing the current crop of activists who have been pushing for it claim that they've been fighting against for decades now.